The panic wasn't triggered by raised voices or confrontation. What unnerved people was the sudden absence of noise, the endless drone of slogans, justifications, and circular arguments that had filled the air for so long. In that unexpected quiet, something remarkable occurred. Individuals found themselves able to think once more. A particular illusion collapsed under its own accumulated weight. A carefully constructed narrative, one that had been shielded and defended, suddenly stumbled and could not continue. During that brief interruption, millions experienced a strange, almost physical sense of relief, one they couldn't immediately explain but instantly recognized as familiar. For an extended period, the harm had remained invisible because it was carefully disguised. It concealed itself behind technical language, excessive footnotes, and performative displays of moral concern. Rather than attacking people directly, it simply wore them down through exhaustion. Confusion became the primary currency of exchange because confused populations are far easier to manage. When clarity is absent, meaningful challenge becomes nearly impossible. The entire apparatus survived not through correctness but through deliberate difficulty, making questioning feel foolish, cruel, or uninformed. Something shifted without fanfare or dramatic gestures. The intensity receded. Questions grew simpler, more pointed, and increasingly difficult to avoid. What is genuinely true here? Who gains from this arrangement? Who quietly absorbs the consequences without acknowledgement? These questions accused no one. Instead, they illuminated the underlying architecture. Once revealed, that architecture appeared fragile, over-engineered, perpetually defensive, dependent on people never slowing down long enough to see it clearly. This recognition landed instantly. People sensed it in their bodies before they could articulate it in words. The persistent feeling of being manipulated began to ease. The quiet shame of wondering whether doubt indicated personal failing started to dissolve. The transformation wasn't about opinions changing overnight. Rather, instincts that had been treated as defects suddenly became valid again. Language finally aligned with experience, and this correspondence proved deeply stabilizing to the human psyche. Those positioned within the existing structures sensed the change too, perhaps even more acutely. They weren't attacked, but the assumptions they had relied upon were suddenly exposed. Personal attacks can be absorbed. Professional titles can deflect responsibility. Yet when foundational premises are questioned calmly and publicly, the entire edifice begins to shake. Lucrative illusions depend on unquestioned foundations, and once those foundations are named publicly, they cannot be unseen. What enabled the spread wasn't authority or forceful insistence. It was repeatability. The ideas were articulated clearly enough to pass from person to person without distortion. When truths become easy to repeat, they propagate faster than any organized campaign could achieve. The systems that cause the most damage rarely announce themselves as cruel or malicious. They have no need to. They persist by presenting themselves as essential, unavoidable, or simply too complex for ordinary people to challenge. Their strength derives not from force but from fog. When populations cannot clearly articulate what is wrong, they struggle to oppose it effectively. Confusion serves as a shield, while ambiguity becomes protective armor. These systems thrive on layering, layer upon layer of terminology that sounds precise but explains nothing meaningful. Layer upon layer of procedures designed to diffuse responsibility. Layer upon layer of moral language specifically crafted to discourage scrutiny. Every aspect gets framed as nuanced, settled, or beyond comprehension of regular people. The implicit message, subtle but constant, instructs everyone to trust the process, defer to experts, and avoid asking awkward questions. Over time, people internalize this message. They sense something is amiss, but assume the problem lies in their own understanding rather than in the structure itself. Accountability dissolves in such environments. When outcomes prove harmful, no single individual bears responsibility. Only committees, abstract frameworks, or distant objectives. Harm gets reframed as an unfortunate side effect of progress. Costs distribute so widely that no single instance seems outrageous on its own, even as cumulative damage becomes immense. Because no clear antagonist emerges, full outrage never ignites. Instead, people experience low-grade unease, chronic tension they gradually learn to tolerate. Words undergo stretching until they lose connection with reality. Definitions shift depending on convenience. Terms that once described concrete things get repurposed to signal virtue or mandatory compliance. When language stops pointing toward truth and starts signaling social status, genuine conversation becomes impossible. Disagreement no longer concerns facts or outcomes, but whether questioning itself is permitted. In such an environment, silence feels safer than honesty. Incentives quietly reinforce the entire arrangement. Those who benefit most receive rewards for maintaining complexity rather than resolving it. Careers build on managing problems rather than solving them. Funding flows toward expansion rather than correction. The system doesn't require unethical individuals. It requires only people responding rationally to distorted incentives. Over time, even well-intentioned participants become defenders of something they privately doubt, because stepping outside carries professional and social risks. Most people live with a persistent sensation that they are missing something obvious. They watch explanations multiply while genuine clarity diminishes. They hear reassurances that everything functions as designed, even as outcomes deteriorate. The gap between official narratives and lived experience widens, generating quiet psychological strain. People begin to distrust their own perceptions. They ask fewer questions, not because they feel satisfied, but because questioning seems futile. This explains how such systems endure for years or even decades, not through overt suppression, but through exhaustion. Not by silencing critics outright, but by burying them under layers of complexity. As long as confusion remains intact, the structure remains stable. As long as problems remain unnamed, they remain unchallenged, quietly shaping lives in ways that feel personal but are anything but accidental. What changed wasn't volume or aggressive posturing. What changed was restraint. Rather than adding another layer of commentary to an already crowded conversation, something was removed. Unnecessary complexity peeled away, not to oversimplify, but to reveal what had been carefully obscured. Where others performed absolute certainty, there was patience. Where others signaled tribal allegiance, there was genuine inquiry. That alone altered the temperature of every exchange. The approach proved unexpectedly simple. Instead of responding to conclusions, attention redirected toward foundational premises. Before debating what should be done, the question became whether underlying claims were even accurate. Facts separated from interpretations, outcomes from intentions. This wasn't an attempt to win an argument. It was an insistence on understanding what was actually being argued. That insistence exposed how many positions were built on assumptions never tested publicly. Rather than moral accusations, structural questions emerged. Who benefits if this framework continues? Who quietly absorbs the losses? What incentives reward compliance and punish dissent? These questions accused individuals of nothing. They mapped the terrain. Once the terrain became visible, it became obvious why certain ideas received such fierce protection. Not because they worked, but because they served specific interests while distributing costs invisibly. Clarity possesses peculiar power because it removes hiding places. When an argument reduces to essential claims, nowhere remains to retreat behind jargon or emotional appeals. Vague language stops functioning. Appeals to authority lose force when authorities cannot explain their reasoning in plain terms. What remains is either coherent or it isn't. Many things that sounded impressive in abstract language collapsed when translated into everyday speech. This approach also altered emotional dynamics. Without shouting or ridicule, defensiveness had nothing to latch onto. Disagreement no longer appeared as hostility but as genuine examination. That distinction matters profoundly. People prove far more willing to reconsider views when they don't feel attacked. By refusing to escalate, space opened for thought rather than reaction. Conversations slowed, and in that slower pace, weaknesses became visible. Perhaps most unsettling for those invested in old patterns was the refusal to offer replacement dogma. No new slogan emerged for memorization, no new identity for adoption. The focus remained on standards rather than predetermined outcomes, on evidence, coherence, and responsibility. That made the challenge harder to dismiss. One can argue against a proposal, but arguing against the idea that claims should be truthful, that actions should produce measurable results, and that costs should be acknowledged honestly proves far more difficult. By returning repeatedly to foundational principles, discussions anchored to something stable. No matter how topics shifted, the same questions applied. Is this real? Does this work? Who pays for it? That consistency created trust, not through charm or authority, but through reliability. People could follow reasoning step by step and reach their own conclusions. Once individuals realize they can think clearly for themselves, the spell of confusion begins to break. The response wasn't immediate because people were persuaded. It was immediate because they recognized something they had been missing. A sudden alignment occurred between what they had quietly felt for a long time and what was finally being spoken aloud. That alignment produces relief before it produces agreement, the sensation of no longer needing to twist personal perception to match an official story that never quite fit. When words accurately describe reality, the mind relaxes. For many, the experience had been one of persistent self-doubt. They noticed contradictions, inefficiencies, and outcomes that didn't match promises. Yet every public explanation insisted the problem lay elsewhere, or worse, within the questioner. Over time, this creates internal conflict. Either reality is wrong or you are. When clear articulation finally mirrors lived experience, that conflict dissolves. The relief people felt wasn't excitement but the easing of psychological pressure. This explains why the effect traveled so quickly. It didn't require people to adopt new beliefs. It allowed them to trust their existing perceptions again. They didn't feel instructed, they felt understood. That distinction matters. Instruction demands obedience. Understanding restores confidence. Once people feel confident in their capacity to judge what they observe, they become far less dependent on external validation. Language played a critical role, precise without being technical, firm without being theatrical. Complex ideas translated into simple questions anyone could repeat without distortion. That repeatability allowed insight to spread organically. People shared it not as a slogan, but as a personal realization. This explains why something felt wrong for so long. When ideas spread this way, they don't feel imposed, they feel discovered. Another reason the impact proved so widespread was the removal of shame from skepticism. Many people had learned to associate questioning with moral failure or ignorance. Doubt got framed as cruelty, hesitation as weakness. By calmly acknowledging uncertainty and examining claims openly, a different message emerged. Questioning isn't a defect, it's a responsibility. That reframe proved profoundly liberating. It gave people permission to think without first apologizing for it. There was also a sense of collective recognition. Individuals realized they weren't alone in their confusion or discomfort. What they had assumed was private unease turned out to be widely shared. That realization reduces isolation, which serves as one of the most powerful tools any dysfunctional system relies upon. When people believe they are alone, they stay quiet. When they realize millions share the same tension, silence becomes much harder to maintain. Importantly, the relief wasn't rooted in optimism about the future. It wasn't a promise that everything would be fixed. It was something more grounded, the feeling that reality could be named accurately again. That accuracy restores orientation. People can endure difficulty if they understand it, but they struggle when asked to deny what they see. By giving form to what had been formless unease, clarity spread not as argument but as recognition. And recognition, once it happens, cannot easily be undone. Those working closest to the system felt the shift almost immediately, even without public acknowledgement, not because they were singled out, but because how conversations changed removed many usual defenses. No personal attacks existed to rally against, no insults to dismiss as bitterness or ignorance. What appeared instead was something far more unsettling, careful examination of ideas themselves. For anyone whose position depended on those ideas remaining unexamined, that constituted a serious threat. Within established structures, survival often depends on maintaining certain assumptions as untouchable. These assumptions function like load-bearing beams, rarely discussed, rarely justified, almost never questioned aloud. Entire strategies, careers, and revenue streams are built upon them. When those underlying premises are calmly exposed and tested, a kind of structural anxiety emerges. Even if the surface still appears intact, people can feel stress traveling through the framework. What made this particularly noticeable to insiders was the absence of hostility. Hostility provides familiar territory. It's easy to manage. It triggers rehearsed responses, public statements, and reputational shields. Calm scrutiny offers no such script. When questions are asked plainly and repeatedly without accusation, usual deflection techniques begin failing. Jargon sounds hollow. Appeals to consensus feel thin. Authority without explanation becomes uncomfortable. Many inside the system already understood its weaknesses. They had seen data that didn't align with messaging. They had watched inefficiencies multiply while official narratives remained unchanged. But as long as these contradictions stayed internal, they could be managed privately. What changed was that those contradictions were now being articulated publicly in a way that matched what insiders had noticed but rarely voiced. That created a moment of recognition difficult to ignore. There was also a professional dimension to the unease. When assumptions are questioned, competence is implicitly tested. If a framework cannot be defended on its merits, those responsible for implementing it face an uncomfortable implication. It's far easier to fend off criticism aimed at character than criticism aimed at logic. Logic demands an answer. When answers aren't readily available, credibility begins eroding quietly, even if no one admits it outright. Another factor was the focus on incentives rather than intentions. Many people within industries saw themselves as well-meaning, even ethical. By shifting attention to how incentives shape behavior regardless of intent, the conversation bypassed personal virtue entirely. That reframing made claiming moral exemption harder. One could be sincere while still participating in something harmful. That realization proves deeply destabilizing, especially in environments that rely on moral self-conception as insulation. What ultimately drew attention from those at the top was the realization that this mode of critique couldn't be easily contained. It didn't depend on insider knowledge or privileged access. It relied on reasoning anyone could follow. Once assumptions are named and examined in plain language, they stop belonging exclusively to experts. They become public property. When the public begins understanding a system's foundations, the leverage of those who once controlled the narrative weakens in ways that are subtle, cumulative, and very difficult to reverse. What made the impact so forceful wasn't exposing a single flaw or dismantling one argument. It was reintroducing standards that had quietly been lowered over time, not replaced with better ones, simply eroded until almost anything could pass if it aligned with the right narrative. When standards slip, confusion fills the gap. When standards return, the contrast is immediate and uncomfortable. For a long while, outcomes had been judged by intention rather than effect. If the stated goal sounded virtuous, poor results were tolerated, explained away, or reframed as temporary setbacks. Evidence became selective, data supporting the narrative elevated, while inconvenient information dismissed as irrelevant or harmful. Over time, this created an environment where failure could persist indefinitely, protected by moral language rather than corrected by results. The shift occurred when basic expectations were restored. Claims were expected to correspond with reality. Policies were expected to produce measurable improvements, not just reassuring rhetoric. Responsibility reattached to decision-making. These aren't radical demands, but they feel radical in systems that have grown accustomed to operating without them. When such expectations reappear, many long-standing practices suddenly look indefensible. This recentering around competence proved especially destabilizing. Competence is impartial. It doesn't care about affiliations, intentions, or identity. It asks only whether something works and whether it causes harm. In environments where status has been maintained through alignment rather than effectiveness, competence threatens. It exposes gaps that cannot be patched with slogans. It forces comparison between promises and results, and those comparisons are rarely flattering. Equally disruptive was the insistence on evidence as a living standard rather than a ceremonial one. Evidence is meant to inform action, not decorate it. When treated seriously, it demands revision in light of new information. Many structures resist this because revision implies error, and error implies accountability. By reasserting that evidence matters more than narrative consistency, the entire system was placed under a kind of continuous audit. Responsibility, once reintroduced, completed the triad. Decisions were no longer abstract. Costs were no longer hypothetical. Someone somewhere was paying for every failure, even if that cost had been diffused and obscured. Naming that reality made hiding behind complexity harder. It reminded people that systems don't fail in theory, they fail in lives, time, and opportunity. The reason this struck so deeply is that standards act like gravity. You can ignore them for a while, but you cannot escape their pull indefinitely. When absent, dysfunction can masquerade as progress. When they return, illusions lose buoyancy. Practices that once floated on moral certainty begin sinking under their own weight. Importantly, nothing new had to be invented. No alternative ideology was required. The force came from restoration, not innovation. By reasserting principles most people already accept in everyday life, truthfulness, effectiveness, accountability, the gap between common sense and institutional behavior became impossible to overlook. That gap, once seen clearly, generates pressure far more powerful than outrage because it is grounded in reality rather than emotion. Once the shift began, containment attempts failed for a simple reason. It didn't rely on permission. There was no central authority to appeal to, no institution to pressure, no individual whose silence would reverse the effect. What was released into the world wasn't a campaign or a directive, but a way of thinking people could adopt independently. Ideas that can be used without approval prove almost impossible to suppress. The clarity spread because it was usable. People didn't need specialized training or insider access to apply it. The questions were basic, almost obvious once spoken aloud. Is this true? Does this work? Who bears the cost? Anyone could ask them. Anyone could test them against their own experience. That made the insight portable. It moved from conversation to conversation, stripped of personality and preserved through reasoning. Efforts to discredit it encountered a structural problem. Character attacks fell flat because the ideas didn't depend on personal authority. Misrepresentation didn't hold because the logic was simple enough to be checked directly. There was no dense theory to distort, no obscure framework to caricature. When something is this straightforward, distortion becomes difficult to sustain. People can recognize when a critique fails to engage with the actual argument. Another reason it couldn't be stopped is that it didn't demand belief. It invited examination. That subtle distinction changes everything. Belief can be enforced or prohibited, examination cannot. Once people begin examining claims for themselves, control shifts permanently. Even if one message is silenced, the habit of questioning remains, and habits of mind, once formed, don't disappear easily. There was also a cumulative effect. Each person who articulated the reasoning clearly made it easier for the next person to do the same. The idea became refined through repetition, not diluted. Weak interpretations fell away, strong formulations persisted. This kind of natural selection strengthens ideas over time, especially when anchored in observable reality. What survives is what continues making sense across contexts. Attempts to reintroduce confusion only highlighted the contrast. After experiencing clarity, people became more sensitive to obfuscation. Vague language stood out. Circular explanations triggered skepticism rather than compliance. What once passed unnoticed now felt evasive. This change in perception is critical. It means old tools lose effectiveness, not because they are exposed publicly, but because they no longer work internally on individuals. Perhaps most importantly, the spread didn't require outrage to sustain it. Outrage burns hot and fades quickly. Clarity is quieter, but it lasts. It integrates into how people interpret information going forward. Once someone learns to reduce claims to foundational principles, they apply that skill everywhere. The effect compounds across domains, creating a broader shift in expectations. This explains why containment failed. You can restrict platforms, manage narratives, and issue corrections, but you cannot easily reverse a widespread improvement in discernment. Once people discover they can understand complex issues without surrendering judgment, they don't return to confusion willingly. When a truth can be grasped, repeated, and applied without distortion, it stops being an event and becomes part of how reality is processed. No rebellion was ignited, no banner rallied around. What happened was quieter and far more consequential. A falsehood that had been quietly shaping behavior lost its coherence, not because it was shouted down, but because it was seen clearly. And once seen clearly, it could no longer demand obedience. That's why the effect was immediate. Lies require constant maintenance. Truth does not. When clarity enters at the right moment, the world doesn't need to be forced to change. It begins correcting itself.